You'd be hard-pressed to find, in this day and age, someone who hasn't seen the Nutcracker, or at least heard one of the many iconic songs from the famous ballet that tells the story of a small girl who's whisked away into a mystical, magical, wintry wonderland and helps the Nutcracker defeat the Mouse King. But have you ever wondered, hey, what's that Mouse King's deal? Where's the beef? And wait, the Nutcracker was a man the whole time? How did he become a Nutcracker? When did that happen? How? What? These questions may not have been answered in Tchaikovsky's ballet, but the Nutcracker's origin story is told in the original story the ballet is based on, E.T.A. Hoffman's The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. In the first installment of my new series Depictions of Fictions, let me read to you this excerpt from The Nutcracker and the Mouse King as I found it in the Big Book of Classic Fantasy, an anthology edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. While I read this story within a story, feel free to sit back and watch as I paint an illustration of a major scene from the story. Now, without further ado, here I have for you the story of the hard nut. And yes, that really is the name of the story. We'll just move on. Anyways.
Pirlipat's mother was the wife of a king, that is, a queen, and in consequence, Pirlipat, the moment she was born, was a princess by birth. The king was beside himself for joy. As he saw his beautiful little daughter lying in her cradle, he danced about and hopped on one leg and sang out, "Was anything ever so beautiful as my Pirlipatkin?" And all the ministers, presidents, generals, and staff officers hopped likewise on one leg and cried out, "No, never!" However, the real fact is that it is quite impossible, as long as the world lasts, that a princess should be born more beautiful than Pirlipat. Her little face looked like a web of the most beautiful lilies and roses, her eyes were the brightest blue, and her hair was like curling threads of shining gold. Besides all of this, Pirlipat came into the world with 2 rows of pearly teeth, with which 2 hours after her birth, she bit the Lord Chancellor's thumb so hard he cried out, "Oh Gemini!" Some say he cried out, "Oh dear!" But on this subject, people's opinions are very much divided, even to the present day. In short, Pirlipat bit the Lord Chancellor on the thumb, and all the kingdom immediately declared that she was the wittiest, sharpest, cleverest little girl, as well as the most beautiful. Now, everybody was delighted, except the queen. She was anxious and dispirited, and nobody knew the reason. Everybody was puzzled to know why she caused Pirlipat's cradle to be so strictly guarded. Besides having guards at the door, 2 nurses always sat close to the cradle, and 6 other nurses sat every night round the room, and what was most extraordinary, each of these 6 nurses was obliged to sit with a great tomcat in her lap, and to keep stroking him all night to amuse him and to keep him awake. Now, my dear little children, it is quite impossible that you should know why Pirlipat's mother took all these precautions, but I know, and will tell you all about it. It happened that, once upon a time, a great many excellent kings and agreeable princesses were assembled at the court of Pirlipat's father, and their arrival was celebrated by all sorts of tournaments and plays and balls. The king, in order to show how rich he was, determined to treat them with a feast which should astonish them. So he privately sent for the upper court cookmaster and ordered him to order the upper court astronomer to fix the time for a general pig killing and a universal sausage making. Then he jumped into his carriage and called himself on all the kings and queens, but he only asked them to eat a bit of mutton with him in order to enjoy their surprise at the delightful entertainment he had prepared for them. Then he went to the queen and said, "You already know, my love, the partiality I entertain for sausages." Now the queen knew perfectly well what he was going to say, which was that she herself, as indeed she had often done before, should undertake to superintend the sausage making. So the first lord of the treasury was obliged to hand out the golden sausage pot and the silver saucepans, and a large fire was made of sandalwood. The queen put on her damask kitchen pinafore. Soon after, the sausage soup was steaming and boiling in the kettle. The delicious smell penetrated as far as the privy council chamber. The king was seized with such extreme delight that he could not stand it any longer. "With your leave," said he, "my lords and gentlemen," jumped over the table, ran down into the kitchen, gave the queen a kiss, stirred about the sausage brew with his golden scepter, and then returned back to the privy council chamber in an easy and contented state of mind. The queen had now come to the point in the sausage making when the bacon was cut into little bits and roasted on little silver spits. The ladies of honor retired from the kitchen, for the queen, with a proper confidence in herself and consideration for her royal husband, performed alone this important operation. But just when the bacon began to roast, a little whispering voice was heard. "Sister, I am a queen as well as you. Give me some roasted bacon too." Then the queen knew it was Mrs. Mouserings who was talking. Mrs. Mouserings had lived a long time in the palace. She declared she was a relation of the king's, and a queen into the bargain, and she had a great number of attendants and courtiers underground. The queen was a mild, good-natured woman, and although she neither acknowledged Mrs. Mouserings for a queen nor for a relation, yet she could not, on such a holiday as this, grudge her a little bit of bacon. So she said, "Come out, Mrs. Mouserings, and eat as much as you please of my bacon." Out hops Mrs. Mouserings, as merry as you please, jumped on the table, stretched out her pretty little paw, and ate one piece of bacon after the other, until at last the queen got quite tired of her. But then out came all Mrs. Mouserings' relations and her 7 sons, ugly little fellows, and nibbled all over the bacon, while the poor queen was so frightened that she could not drive them away. Luckily, however, when there still remained a little bacon, the first lady of the bedchamber happened to come in. She drove all the mice away and sent for the court mathematician, who divided the little that was left as equally as possible among all the sausages. Now sounded the drums and the trumpets. The princes and potentates who were invited rode forth in glittering garments, some under white canopies, others in magnificent coaches, to the sausage feast. The king received them with hearty friendship and elegant politeness, then as master of the land with scepter and crown, sat down at the head of the table. The first course was polonies. Even then it was remarked that the king grew paler and paler. His eyebrows were raised to heaven, his breast heaved with sighs. In fact, he seemed to be agitated by some deep and inward sorrow. But when the blood puddings came on, he fell back in his chair, groaning and moaning, sighing and crying. Everybody rose from the table. The physicians in ordinary in vain endeavored to feel the king's pulse. A deep and unknown grief had taken possession of him. At last, after several attempts had been made, several violent remedies applied, such as burning feathers under his nose and the like, the king came to himself and almost inaudibly gasped out the words, "Too little bacon." Then the queen threw herself in despair at his feet. "Oh, my poor unlucky royal husband," said she, "what sorrows have you had to endure? But see here the guilty one at your feet. Strike and spare not. Mrs. Mouserings and her 7 sons and all her relations ate up the bacon, and here the queen tumbled backwards in a fainting fit. But the king arose in a violent passion, and said he, "My lady of the bedchamber, explain this matter." The lady of the bedchamber explained as far as she knew, and the king swore vengeance on Mrs. Mouserings and her family for having eaten up the bacon which was destined for the sausages. the Lord Chancellor was called upon to institute a suit against Mrs. Mouserings and to confiscate the whole of her property. But as the king thought that this would not prevent her from eating his bacon, the whole affair was entrusted to the court, machine, and the watchmaker. This man was promised, by a peculiar and extraordinary operation, to expel Mrs. Mouserings and her family from the palace forever. He invented curious machines, in which pieces of roasted bacon were hung on little threads, and which he set round the dwelling of Mrs. Mouserings. But Mrs. Mouserings was far too cunning not to see the artifices of the court watch and machine maker. Still, all her warnings, all her cautions, were in vain. Her 7 sons, and a great number of her relations, deluded by the sweet smell of bacon, entered the watchmaker's machines, where as soon as they bit at the bacon, a trap fell on them, and then they were quickly sent to judgment and execution in the kitchen. Mrs. Mouserings, with the small remnants of her court, left the place of sorrow, doubt, and astonishment. The court was rejoiced, but the queen alone was sorrowful, for she knew well Mrs. Mouserings' disposition, and that she would never allow the murder of her sons and relations to go unrevenged. It happened as she expected. One day, while she was cooking some tripe for the king, a dish to which he was particularly partial, appeared Mrs. Mouserings and said, "You have murdered my sons, and you have killed my cousins and relations. Take good care that the mouse, queen, does not bite your little princess in two. Take care." After saying this, she disappeared, but the queen was so frightened that she dropped the tripe into the fire, and thus, for the 2nd time, Mrs. Mouserings spoiled the dish the king liked best, and of course he was very angry. And now you know why the queen took such extraordinary care of Princess Perlipatkin. Was not she right to fear that Mrs. Mouserings would fulfill her threat, come back, and bite the princess to death? The machines of the machine maker were not of the slightest use against the clever and cunning Mrs. Mouserings, but the court astronomer, who was also upper astrologer and stargazer, discovered that only the tomcat family could keep Mrs. Mouserings from the princess's cradle. For this reason, each of the nurses carried one of the sons of this family on her lap, and by continually stroking him down the back, managed to render the otherwise unpleasant court service less intolerable. It was once at midnight, as one of the 2 chief nurses, who sat close by the cradle, awoke as if it were from a deep sleep. Everything around lay in profound repose, no purring, but the stillness of death. But how astonished was the chief nurse when she saw close before her a great ugly mouse, who stood upon its hind legs and already had laid its hideous head on the face of the princess. With a shriek of anguish, she sprung up. Everybody awoke, but Mrs. Mouserings, for she it was who had been in Perlipat's cradle, jumped down and ran into the corner of the room. The tomcats went after, but too late. She had escaped through a hole in the floor. Perlipat awoke with the noise and wept aloud. "Thank heaven," cried the nurses, "she lives!" But what was their horror when, looking at the before beautiful child, they saw the change which had taken place in her. Instead of the lovely white and red cheeks which she had had before, the shining golden hair, there was now a great deformed head on a little withered body. The blue eyes had changed into a pair of great green gogglers, and the mouth had stretched from ear to ear. The queen was almost mad with grief and vexation, and the walls of the king's study were obliged to be wadded, because he was always dashing his head against them for sorrow, and crying out, "Oh, luckless monarch!" He might have seen how it would have been better to have eaten the sausage without bacon, and to have allowed Mrs. Mouserings quietly to stay underground. Upon this subject, however, Perlipat's royal father did not think at all, but he laid all of the blame on the court watchmaker, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg. He therefore issued this wise order: that Drosselmeyer should before 4 weeks restore the princess to her former state, or at least find out a certain and infallible means for doing so, or, in failure thereof, should suffer a shameful death under the axe of the executioner. Drosselmeyer was terribly frightened, but trusting to his learning and good fortune, he immediately performed the first operation which seemed necessary to him. He carefully took Princess Pirlipat to pieces, took off her hands and feet, and thus was able to see the inward structure. But there, alas, he found that the princess would grow uglier as she grew older, and he had no remedy for it. He put the princess neatly together again, and sunk down in despair at her cradle, which he never was permitted to leave. The 4th week had begun. Yes, it was Wednesday, when the king, with eyes flashing with indignation, entered the room of the princess, and waving his scepter, he cried about, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, cure the princess or die!" Drosselmeyer began to cry bitterly, but little Princess Pirlipat went on cracking her nuts. Then first was the court watchmaker struck with the princess's extraordinary partiality for nuts, and the circumstance of her having come into the world with teeth. In fact, she had cried incessantly since her metamorphosis, until someone by chance gave her a nut. She immediately cracked it, ate the kernel, and was quiet. From that time, the nurses found nothing so effectual as to bring her nuts. O holy instinct of natural, eternal, and unchangeable sympathy of all beings! Thou showest me the door to the secret. I will knock, and thou wilt open it. He then asked permission to speak to the court astronomer, and was led out to him under a strong guard. These 2 gentlemen embraced with many tears, for they were great friends. They then entered into a secret cabinet, where they looked over a great number of books which treated of instinct, sympathies, antipathies, and other deep subjects. The night came. The court astronomer looked to the stars, and made the horoscope of the princess with the assistance of Drosselmeyer, who was also very clever in this science. It was a troublesome business, for the lines were always wandering this way and that. At last, however, what was their joy to find that the Princess Pirlipat, in order to be freed from the enchantment which made her so ugly, and to become beautiful again, had only to eat the sweet kernel of the nut Krakatuk. Now the nut Krakatuk had such a hard shell that an 840-pound cannon could drive over without breaking it. But this nut was only to be cracked by a man who had never shaved and never worn boots. He was to break it in the princess's presence, and then to present the kernel to her with his eyes shut, nor was he to open his eyes until he had walked 7 steps backward without stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer worked without stopping 3 days and 3 nights, and as the king was at dinner on Saturday, Drosselmeyer, who was to have his head off Sunday morning early, rushed into the room and declared he had found the means of restoring the Princess Pirlipat to her former beauty. The king embraced him with fervent affection, promised him a diamond sword, 4 orders, and 2 new coats for Sundays. "We will go to work immediately after dinner," said the king in the most friendly manner, "and thou, dear watchmaker, must see that the young unshaven gentleman in shoes be ready with the nut Krakatuk. Take care, too, that he drink no wine before, that he may not stumble as he walks his 7 steps backwards like a crab. Afterwards, he may get as tipsy as he pleases." Drosselmeyer was very much frightened at the speech of the king's, and it was not without fear and trembling that he stammered out that it was true that the means were known, but that both the nut Krakatuk and the young man to crack it were yet to be sought for. So it was not impossible that the nut and cracker would never be found at all. In tremendous fury, the king swung his scepter over his crowned head and cried with a lion's voice, "Then you must be beheaded, as I said before." It was a lucky thing for the anxious and unfortunate Drosselmeyer that the king had found his dinner very good that day, and so was in a disposition to listen to any reasonable suggestions which the magnanimous queen, who deplored Drosselmeyer's fate, did not fail to bring forward. Drosselmeyer took courage to plead that, as he had found out the remedy and the means whereby the princess might be cured, he was entitled to his life. The king said this was all stupid nonsense, but after he had drunk a glass of sherry brandy, concluded that both the watchmaker and the astronomer should immediately set off on their journey and never return except with the Nutcracker in their pocket. The man who was to crack the same was, at the Queen's suggestion, to be advertised for in all the newspapers in the country and out of it. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been 15 years on their journey without finding any traces of the Nutcracker. The countries in which they were and the wonderful sights they saw would take me a month at least to tell of. This, however, I shall not do. All I shall say is that at last the miserable Drosselmeyer felt an irresistible longing to see his native town Nuremberg. This longing came upon him most particularly as he and his friend were sitting together smoking a pipe in the middle of a wood in Asia. "O Nuremberg, delightful city, who has not seen thee him I pity? All that beautiful is in London, Petersburg, or Paris are nothing when compared to thee, Nuremberg, my own city." As Drosselmeyer deplored his fate in this melancholy manner, the astronomer, struck with pity for his friend, began to howl so loudly that it was heard all over Asia. But at last he stopped crying, wiped his eyes, and said, "Why do we sit here and howl, my worthy colleague? Why don't we set off at once for Nuremberg? Is it not perfectly the same where and how we seek this horrid Nutcracker?" "You are right," said Drosselmeyer. So they both got up, emptied their pipes, and walked from the wood in the middle of Asia to Nuremberg at a stretch. As soon as they had arrived in Nuremberg, Drosselmeyer hastened to the house of a cousin of his, called Christopher Zachariah Drosselmeyer, who was a carver and gilder, and whom he had not seen for a long, long time. To him the watchmaker related the whole history of Princess Pirlipat, of Mrs. Mouserings, and the Nutcracker, so that Christopher Zachariah clapped his hands for wonder and said, "Oh, cousin, cousin, what extraordinary stories are these!" Drosselmeyer then told his cousin of the adventures which befell him on his travels, how he had visited the Grand Duke of Almonds and the King of Walnuts, how he had inquired in the Horticultural Society of Acornshausen. In short, how he had sought everywhere, but in vain, to find some traces of the nuts of Krakatuk. During this recital, Christopher Zachariah had been snapping his fingers and opening his eyes, calling out and ha and oh and ah. At last he threw his cap and wig up to the ceiling and embraced his cousin and said, "Cousin, I'm very much mistaken, I say, if I don't myself possess this Nutcracker." He then fetched a little box, out of which he took a gilded nut of middling size. "Now," said he, as he showed his cousin the nut, "the history of this nut is this. Several years ago, a man came here on Christmas Eve with a sack full of nuts, which he offered to sell cheap. He put the sack just before my booth to guard it against the nut sellers of the town, who could not bear that a foreigner should sell nuts in their native city. At that moment, a heavy wagon passed over his sack and cracked every nut in it except one, which the man, laughing in an extraordinary way, offered to sell me for a silver half-crown of the year 1720. This seemed odd to me. I found just such a half-crown in my pocket, bought the nut, and gilded it, not knowing myself why I bought it so dear and valued it so much." Every doubt with respect to its being the nut which they sought was removed by the astronomer, who, after removing the gilding, found written on the shell in Chinese characters the word Krakatuk. The joy of the travelers was excessive, and Drosselmeyer's cousin the gilder, the happiest man under the sun, on being promised a handsome pension and the gilding of all the gold in the treasury into the bargain, the two gentlemen, the watchmaker and the astronomy, had put on their nightcaps and were going to bed, when the latter, that is, the astronomer, said, My worthy friend and colleague, you know one piece of luck follows another, and I believe that we have not only found the Nutcracker, but also the young man who shall crack it and present the kernel of beauty to the princess. This person I conceive to be the son of your cousin. Yes, continued he, I am determined not to sleep until I have cast the youth's horoscope. With these words he took his nightcap from his head and instantly commenced his observations. In fact, the gilder's son was a handsome, well-grown lad, who had never shaved, never worn boots. At Christmas, he used to wear an elegant red coat embroidered with gold, a sword and a hat under his arm, besides having his hair beautifully powdered and curled. In this way, he used to stand before his father's booth, and with a gallantry which was born with him, crack the nuts for the young ladies, who, from this peculiar quality of his, had already called him Nutcrackerkin. Next morning, the astronomer felt delighted on the neck of the watchmaker and cried, "We have him, he is found! But there are two things of which, my dear friend and colleague, we must take particular care. First, we must strengthen the under jaw of your excellent nephew with a tough piece of wood, and then, on returning home, we must carefully conceal having brought with us the young man who is to bite the nut. For I read by the horoscope that the king, after several people have broken their teeth in vainly attempting to crack the nut, will promise to him who shall crack it, and restore the princess to her former beauty, will promise, I say, to this man the princess for a wife and his kingdom after his death." Of course the gilder was delighted with the idea of his son marrying the Princess Pirlipat and becoming a prince and king, and delivered him over to the two deputies. The wooden jaw which Drosselmeyer had fixed in his young and hopeful nephew answered to admiration, so that in cracking the hardest peach stones he came off with distinguished success. As soon as Drosselmeyer and his comrade had made known the discovery of the nut, the requisite advertisements were immediately issued, and as the travelers had returned with the means of restoring the princess's beauty, many hundred young men, among whom several princes might be found, trusting to the soundness of their teeth, attempted to remove the enchantment of the princess. The ambassadors were not a little frightened when they saw the princess again. The little body with the wee hands and feet could scarcely support the immense deformed head. The hideousness of the countenance was increased by a woolly beard, which spread over mouth and chin. Everything happened, though, as the astronomer had foretold. One dandy in shoes after another broke teeth and jaws upon the Nutcracker, without in the slightest degree helping the princess, and as they were carried away, half dead to the dentist, who was always ready, groaned out, "That was a hard nut." When now the king, in the anguish of his heart, had promised his daughter and kingdom to the man who would break the enchantment, the gentle Drosselmeyer made himself known and begged to be allowed the trial. No one had pleased the princess so much as this young man. She laid her little hand on her heart and sighed inwardly. "Ah, if only he were the person destined to crack Krakatuk and be my husband!" Young Drosselmeyer, approaching the queen, the king, and the Princess Pirlipat in the most elegant manner, received from the hands of the chief master of ceremonies the Nutcracker, which he immediately put into his mouth and crack, crack, broke the shell into a dozen pieces. He neatly removed the bits of shell which yet remained in the kernel, and then with the most profound bow presented it to the princess, shut his eyes, and proceeded to step backwards. The princess swallowed the kernel, and oh, wonderful wonder! Her ugliness disappeared, and instead was seen a form of angel beauty, with a countenance like lilies and roses mixed, with eyes of glancing azure, and full locks curling like threads of gold. Drums and trumpets mingled with the rejoicings of the people. The king and the whole court danced upon one leg as before at Pirlipat's birth, and the queen was obliged to be sprinkled all over with eau de cologne, since she had fainted with excessive joy. This great tumult did not a little disturb young Drosselmeyer, who had yet his 7 steps to accomplish. However, he recollected himself, and had just put his right foot back for the 7th step when Mrs. Mouseranks, squeaking in a most hideous manner, raised herself from the floor, so that Drosselmeyer, as he put his foot backwards, trod on her and stumbled, nay, almost fell down. What a misfortune! The young man became at that moment just as ugly as ever was the Princess Pirlipat. The body was squeezed together and could scarcely support the thick deformed head with the great goggling eyes and wide gaping mouth. Instead of the wooden roof for his mouth, a little wooden mantle hung out behind his back. The watchmaker and astronomer were beside themselves with horror and astonishment, but they saw how Mrs. Mouseranks was creeping along the floor all bloody. Her wickedness, however, was not unavenged, for Drosselmeyer had struck her so hard on the neck with the sharp heel of his shoe that she was at the point of death. But just as she was in her last agonies, she squeaked out in the most piteous manner, "Oh, Crackatuck, from thee I die, but Nutcracker dies as well as I, and thou, my son, with the 7 crowns, revenge thy mother's horrid wounds, kill the man who did attack her, that naughty, ugly, wicked Nutcracker." Quick with this cry died Mrs. Mouseranks, and was carried off by the royal housemaid. Nobody had taken the least notice of young Drosselmeyer. The princess, however, reminded the king of his promise, and he immediately ordered the young hero to be brought before him. But when that unhappy young man appeared in his deformed state, the princess put her hands before her and cried out, "Away with that nasty Nutcracker!" So the court-marshal took him by his little shoulder and pushed him out of the door. The king was in a terrible fury that anyone should ever think of making a Nutcracker his son-in-law. He laid all the blame on the watchmaker and astronomer, and banished them both from his kingdom and court. This had not been seen by the astronomer in casting his horoscope. However, he found on reading the stars a second time that young Drosselmeyer would so well behave himself in this new station that in spite of his ugliness, he would yet become prince and king. In the meantime, but with the fervent hope of soon seeing the end of these things, Drosselmeyer remains as ugly as ever, so much so that the Nutcrackers in Nuremberg have always been made after the exact model of his countenance and figure. So while I go ahead and finish the painting, why don't I share my final thoughts on the story of Pirlipat and Krakatuk, aka the Hard Nut. First off, I just want to say, favorite moment in the whole story is at the beginning when Pirlipat, the terrifying baby, with a full set of teeth, in case you forgot, bites the Lord Chancellor's thumb, and everyone goes, "She's the prettiest, wittiest, sharpest, cleverest girl. She's a legend. She's an icon. Miss Pirlipat is the moment." Next, I just want everyone to remember that this whole thing started over bacon bits. I'm going to say it again. Bacon bits. Whenever you see the ballet, hear the music, or see any other cultural reference to the Nutcracker, remember, bacon bits. Related to this, I'm just gonna come out and say it, the king sucked as a person. I don't think he's like a bad dude per se, but I don't know if the man is qualified to run a kingdom other than by virtue of being born a prince. Just as Pirlipat was born as a princess because her mother was a queen and her father was a king. You may have been able to tell as I read, but there were some parts I had a very hard time not laughing through. And one of those times were during the line, he might have seen how that it would have been better to have eaten the sausage without bacon and to have allowed Mrs. Mouserings to stay quietly underground. Upon this subject, however, Pirlipat's royal father did not think at all, but he laid all the blame on the court watchmaker, Drosselmeyer. And some hardcore bacon lovers out there, which I am not, but some out there might say that that was a valid response. But if you're going to be the type of guy who's going to jump up and dance on one foot and make the whole rest of your court do the same thing to celebrate how beautiful your newborn daughter is, then maybe it would be better to not have bacon in your sausage one single time, than have your daughter turned into a wooden monstrosity and have to have the walls of your study padded because you keep striking your head against the walls in grief and despair because now your daughter is ugly. And I know the main theme of the story is the general main theme of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King, and by virtue of that, the ballet, is that beauty does not equal goodness, and true beauty is on the inside, etc., etc. We all heard that, variations of that so many times. But I feel like a secondary theme of this story within a story in particular is maybe set clear boundaries. Considering that this story started as an extreme fantasy / mild body horror version of If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, I feel like some things could have been prevented by the Queen saying, "You can have this little handful, Mrs. Mouserings, but I need the rest for the meal I'm preparing," instead of what she actually said was, "Come out, Mrs. Mouserings, and eat as much as you please of my bacon." Like, you said she could eat as much as she wanted, and she did. Sure, it was a little rude to invite her family to join, and she did breach the unspoken social contract of polite society, in which it's usually understood but never fully stated that one exaggerates their pleasantries and goodwill to seem kinder and more giving to others. But she's also a mouse who thinks she's a queen and somehow blood related to a human king, so maybe it would have been better to have been like a bit clearer as to how far your act of goodwill actually went. And I'm not in any way blaming the Queen for what happened. She was just trying to do her best and just cook her husband one of his favorite meals because he wanted to impress his guests. And Mrs. Mouserings fully chose to curse an innocent baby for the king's actions. Honestly, like, being a queen and like being in the kitchen, getting her hands dirty with that bacon grease, and apparently the best cook in the house, even when she has an entire staff to do everything for her. To be honest, I respect it. And also, she also seemed to somehow be the only one concerned about protecting Pirlipat from Mrs. Mouserings. Maybe it wasn't smart to have all 6 nurses in the room awake and petting the tomcats at the same time. Probably would have been more sustainable in shifts or something. Like, have them there, but have like 1 or 2 people up at a time and everyone else sleeping, so nobody gets exhausted and falls asleep in the middle. I mean, I know Mrs. Mouserings is smarter than your average bear. Mouse. But I don't think 6 cats need to be on guard at the same time. I speak from experience of owning cats. As long as one is awake and goes off in the presence of a mouse or something, it will take but a second for the other cats to wake up and go off as well and go wild. It doesn't take that long for them to get up and get into action, from what I have witnessed. But still, the Queen tried. She was the only one concerned after Pirlipat's birth, And not just because her baby was born with a full set of teeth and formula probably hadn't been invented yet. She was concerned for the safety of her child. Mrs. Mouserings didn't threaten to just curse the child to ugliness. She straight up threatened to bite the child in two. What she did to Perlipat was still horrifying. Not because of the pretty turned ugly thing, but having a great deformed head on a little body, great green gogglers, which whenever I say it makes me think of how like a frog's eyes sit on their face, and a mouth that stretches from ear to ear, sounds like a very painful body to have to grow up in, from babyhood to when we next see her in early teenagerdom. And also, now she could apparently be taken apart and put back together. The story really glossed over that bit, but Drosselmeyer fully disassembled Perlipat and put her back together like she was a computer or a car instead of, a baby. Granted, this does open the possibilities for cool modifications, because presumably, if you can take things off, you can also build things to be put on in its place. Unless the curse would just deform the new thing too to look like the original withered wooden piece. Now I'm thinking of how that would work, especially if she grows up from babyhood. Would she then be considered some sort of fantasy cyborg? Because that would be cool, actually, to think about. But I won't go off right now on a tangent of the possibilities, because that's not why you're here. I'll think about that on my own time. In the Big Book of Classic Fantasy, the editors, Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, put a short bio of the author ahead of each story, and in the bio for E.T.A. Hoffman, they mention that much of his work could be considered a precursor to the modern horror genre. And while this story, and as a whole, the Nutcracker, which I may have said before, I've seen the ballet, I've not read the actual story, but from what I know of the ballet and other bits I read in my research, the Nutcracker as a whole doesn't seem to fit within those works, but you can definitely see little bits sprinkled throughout it. And some things, if you think about it for more than a second, it begins to dawn on you how horrifying and scary, like awful it actually is. Like Perlipat's transformation, and consequently young Drosselmeyer's transformation at the end of the story. It's again only briefly described, but he is described to have taken on not only the deformities that had cursed Perlipat for most of her life, which, mentioned before, painful body to grow up in, but he also has the addition that the wooden support that his uncle Drosselmeyer had invented for him to support his mouth to crack the nut then became a part of his new body, with the little wooden mantle hung out from behind his back that we know that all nutcrackers have is the lever that we press to crack the nut in his mouth. If you think about that little snippet of a sentence for more than a moment, you cannot deny that this is straight up body horror. That's right, I'll say it. Body horror. Christmas themed body horror. Festive holiday body horror, okay? Speaking of, at this point in my discussion of the story, you may still be thinking, hey, how's the Mouse King play into all this? We never figured out what was the Mouse King's beef. We just figured out the Nutcracker became the dude. We were talking about this other mouse, though. The Rat King, or the Mouse King, is not mentioned till the very end, when Mrs. Mouserings, who again thought she was a queen, is dying, and calls to her son with the 7 crowns to avenge her death. When doing research on the story, though, it looks like some translations from the original German to English have her say 7-headed son, and in many of the original portrayals and translations of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King as a whole, the Mouse King does indeed have 7 heads. However, I did find some criticisms and debunking of the same translations having some like silly mistakes and like sort of lazy conversions of words. And this version, as found in the Big Book of Classic Fantasy, seems to be a somewhat fresher translation done by Major Alex Ewing. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that the Mouse King is her son with the 7 crowns, which I took when reading it to be a reference to the 7 sons that Perlipat's father had killed by those traps that Drosselmeyer built after Bacongate. Since Mrs. Mouseranks is a mouse, it wouldn't be a far-off assumption that she'd had another son in the years that Drosselmeyer and the astronomer were searching for Krakatuk and the Nutcracker. Especially a magical mouse with that lifespan, I'm surprised that she only had one more son. Maybe it's just too painful to think of having multiple sons again. I don't know. But whether the Mouse King has 7 crowns left from his deceased brothers, or whether he just happens to have 7 dead brothers and then happened to be born with 7 heads and needed a crown for each head, his beef with the Nutcracker is out of a desire to avenge his dead mother. Which, to be honest, with that knowledge, I sort of get it. I mean, young Drosselmeyer didn't purposely kill Mrs. Mouseranks. She sort of threw herself under his heel. I'm not sure what else she thought was going to happen. But at this point, I think it's safe to say that Mrs. Mouseranks is not a being of reason who thinks of logical consequences, even if she is a very cunning and mystical magical mouse. And it's probably safe to say that she raised her now only son to behave and think in a similar way. Before reading this, I just sort of chalked the Mouse King, or Rat King as he's come to be known in some versions, since I guess mice weren't considered scary enough, I guess. I just sort of chalked it up as opposing the Nutcracker because he's a bad, evil rodent and just a hardcore hater. I never thought I'd think of the Rat King as a relatable villain, but the guy's just trying to avenge his mom's death as per her final wish. He's just trying to carry out her last will and testament, I guess. I mean, if you were a magical mouse who may or may not have 7 heads, but definitely has 7 dead brothers and a dead mother, wouldn't you do the same? Go in the comments, look me in the metaphorical eye, and tell me you would not loathe that Nutcracker to the point of causing violence and mischief to try to kill him. Tell me I'm wrong. I mean, still rooting for the Nutcracker over here and the overall story, but I can still feel a little sad for the Mouse King. I think it adds depth to a story that isn't always depicted as portraying or having much depth beyond the message of true beauty is on the inside. Now let me move on to talk a bit about the painting itself, but before I do that, I have one last thing to say. Drosselmeyer, the watchmaker, the Uncle Drosselmeyer that we all know, also in the ballet, and the astronomer from the story, they gay. First of all, they're described as great friends. They lock themselves up in a secret cabinet and work without stopping for 3 days and 3 nights, and then travel the world together for 15 years, and we find them 15 years later smoking in the middle of a wood in Asia, crying together because Drosselmeyer misses his home. Go back to the comments, look me in the metaphorical eyes again, and tell me they're just a couple of guys being dudes. Try. Convince me. I dare you. You can't. Alright, so now about the painting. As I'm sure you can tell by now, this painting depicts the final scene in which Parlopat has eaten the kernel of Krakatuk. Mrs. Mouserings is uttering her dying plea for her 7-crowned son to avenge her, and young Drosselmeyer is mid-transformation into the Nutcracker. I tried a technique for the line art which I had been thinking of but didn't think would actually work until I saw Katie May try it for her Inktober video, which is doing the line art digitally and then just printing it onto your painting paper instead of having to go through the extra step of tracing with carbon paper or with a light box. I had my doubts about it during the ugly stage, since I thought I'd mostly be working in watercolor with a little bit of gouache. Not sure why I thought that, since I went in really heavy with the watercolor undertones. Not sure quite what I was thinking there, but it came together eventually. I wanted Parlopat to be the main focus of the painting, since in the scene everyone's completely oblivious to what's going on with young Drosselmeyer and Mrs. Mouserings, since they're so focused and overjoyed by Parlopat's return to beauty, because that's what they're focusing on. So Parlopat's undertones are, as you saw in the beginning of me painting, are that bright, vibrant yellow, and then everything becomes darker and closer to some pinks and deep purples the further away from Parlopat the eye is. Although there are other people in the scene, I made sure that Parlopat's brightness mostly reflects on just young Drosselmeyer turning into the Nutcracker and Mrs. Mouserings as she dies. Parlopat herself has her eyes closed as the magical transformation back to her beautiful self returns, self-absorbed in her relief and joy at the curse of being broken, and her refound beauty. The Nutcracker's face cannot be seen, but we see his legs stiffening and squeezing, and I try to depict the hand, sort of the hand turning from flesh to wood. One finger, you can sort of see it up top, the pinky finger is mid-transformation, but usually the Nutcracker is sort of like the Nutcrackers I've seen, the wooden hand is sort of just like a chunk of wood carved into the shape of a hand, and then the finger lines are painted on, so the fingers are sort of fused together. So I made it so that the fingers, except for the pinky, have all fused together, and the pinky is still mid-transformation because it's still ongoing. So you can see as the curse settles upon him, and he turns into the stereotypical Nutcracker we've come to know. I did make Mrs. Mouserings a bit cartoony to keep the piece from getting too serious, since after all this is a very silly story, and I don't draw mice that often, so I just wanted to keep her sort of cartoony so it didn't get like too dark and serious. I did have a long pause between when I finished the watercolor undertones and shadows to when I started with gouache. I know that all art has an ugly phase, but I had gotten into my head about whether I'd be able to take it out of the ugly phase and into the, I wrote on my script, pretty phase, and now I'm connecting it to the themes of the story, so I'm just gonna say like final stages of art. I wasn't sure, you know what, I went on a 15-year journey with my totally platonic BFF, searching around the world with exactly the tools I needed to make my ugly art pretty again. So there was a long gap between the footage, but I hope I edited it in a way that you can't really see the difference between the first bit of footage I filmed 15 years ago and the footage I filmed now. I did have to feed the painting the kernel of Krakatuk and take 7 steps back. I did not kill any mice when I did so, so I am not myself cursed, which is how I'm recording this voiceover. But it was a, you know what, did a lot of traveling, but it was sort of a rough 15 years there in my search for how to get this piece to the pretty phase. And I've gone on too long with this bit, so let me continue reading what I actually scripted out when I wrote down my thoughts. The liner had been printed in too dark of a color, and it was standing out in a bad way in some parts of the painting. Like, it sort of like blended in fine, and then in other parts it just looked bad because I had sort of just like had put a line without like thinking of the direction, thinking it would be covered over easily, and it was not being covered over easily. But once I got in there with the gouache, especially on Perlipat and the Nutcracker, then I was able to turn my brain around and knew I could bring this piece out of the ugly phase. I had given it the girdle of Crockatuck. I did add extra shadows and little details with colored pencil. I especially deepened the shadows on the Nutcracker's clothes and Mrs. Mousetrank's. On them, I used a black color pencil or a very like dark gray to do the shadows, and then on everyone else, unless I was adding in like background shadows, I usually used a color that was the same as like a darker tone of the color that I was shading underneath. So their shadows on the Nutcracker and Mrs. Mousetrank's would be more stark and dramatic since they were in a darker color. I didn't actually put any shadows on Perlipat. I actually just added highlights and let some natural variations in the gouache, like of her dress and hair and skin, give the impression of shadows for her. Again, because I wanted her to be the bright and shining main focus of the piece. Then I planned it for the viewer's eyes to follow where the light of her glow lands to the two secondary figures in our foreground, but the scene itself's background, even in the midst of their own tragedy. I wanted the point of view to be a bit closer to the floor as well, sort of as if the viewer is in the place of the future Mouse King, watching all of this happen as he hears his mother's last cry for revenge. So POV, you are a seven-headed mouse watching all this go down. I can definitely see some improvements that I could have made, but all in all, I'm really happy with how the painting turned out. I'm not entirely sure if the watercolor undertones actually did much, since I did end up going heavier with the gouache than I originally expected, but I like to think that it does have an effect on the piece overall. I tried to focus a lot on the composition this time and how to fit the three separate figures in sort of the same frame and sort of this like triangle foreground, middle ground, background formation along with the other elements and still keep the scene cohesive and sort of in a scene that makes sense. I think I learned a lot in the process of painting this piece, especially in terms of setting a scene and composition, which to be honest makes me even more excited to do more in the new Depictions of Fictions series. I want to try to make Depictions of Fictions a semi-regular series on my channel, and I already have a few short stories also from the big book of classic fantasy that I plan on getting my painterly little paws on in the future. But if you have any recommendations for short fictions that you might like to see on here someday, leave a comment down below. And while you're there, try taking a crack at hitting the like button too. And if you'd like to stay updated on future Depictions of Fictions or my other videos, don't be afraid to step on that subscribe button. Just be warned. Just as a disclaimer, I'm warning you. The subscribe button, Seven Crowned Sun, may try to get revenge on you in the future if you step too hard, so be careful. Step carefully, okay? I appreciate it. I want you to be safe. I don't want any seven-headed mice royalty to claim vengeance on you when you subscribe to the channel. I want you to subscribe safely. But thank you so much for watching if you've watched this far. And I hope to see you all back here soon for yet another Depictions of Fictions.